hey everybody, it's Wednesday, and that means it's time for our weekly check-in. Got my Lord's Supper cup here with my cup of coffee, my pick-me-up to get me through the rest of this midweek, mid-morning Wednesday. Thanks for joining me with your cup of coffee or tea or whatever it is this morning that you have in front of you to keep you going throughout this week. We are in and have been talking about Matthew's account of the life of Jesus, and we are at that point where Jesus has been crucified. We kind of introduced that topic specifically last week, how simply Matthew points out what happened and how gruesome that process was, and what the different accounts of the life and ministry, and particularly death of Jesus, do. There's something you may have heard of. Sometimes they're called the 7 last words of the cross. There's 7 sayings that are spread across the gospel accounts that Jesus says from the cross. And I want to look at one of them that Matthew points out here. It's the one that I believe is the only one in Matthew, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not quite 100% sure, but I think it is the only one. It's in Matthew 27, verse 46. This is what, actually I'll start in verse 45. From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness came over the land. So that's 6th hour is noon. 6 a.m. is the beginning of the day, so 6 hours in is noon. 6 to the 9th hour, noon to 3. Darkness come over all the land. About the 9th hour, here's one of the sayings. Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is Aramaic, but it means, and we're told right here in the translation, my God, why have you forsaken me? Certainly, as we think about the cross and the difficulty that Jesus experienced on the cross, physically, the agony that he was in, but also spiritually, the realities of the cross in that he was crucified for sin, so that he would be our sacrifice for sin. You can certainly understand the agony that would cause him to cry out in that way and feel utterly forsaken by God. But I want to point out something. It's in most translations, not all, but most translations will do this. And that's note at the end of verse 46, at the end of the English translation, my God, why have you forsaken me? Here I'm looking at the NIV, and it points to a footnote that says it references an Old Testament passage, namely Psalm chapter 22. And that's because those words are the first words of Psalm 22. In fact, I have it marked over here, and if I go back to Psalm 22, verse 1, this is what it says. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from the words of my groaning. So you can see very clearly that this psalm begins with that word of Jesus, and Jesus being God and being steeped as a Jewish man in the Hebrew Bible, he would know very well the words of a psalm like this, and he called out that psalm there, certainly to express the difficulty, the agony, both physically and spiritually he was in. But might I suggest, because Jesus is Jesus, there's always something that we can learn, and there's always another thing to see that might be going on. Because what I want to point out is that Psalm 22, the verse that he references, the verse that he quotes, verse 1, in a lot of Psalms, there's what's called a superscript. And it's usually written in smaller print, sometimes in italic, in between the title, Psalm 22, and verse 1. It doesn't have a verse number in it. It's usually smaller, and Psalm 22 is like that. Sometimes they're simple. They just say, of David, or a Psalm of David. This one's a little bit longer. Psalm 22 has this superscript, which says, for the director of music, to the tune of the doe of the morning, a psalm of David. Now, reminder, I've said this before, but just bears repeating, that superscript was original in the Hebrew Bible. That, if you were to go back to the text of the Hebrew that we have, that the English is translated from, that superscript is there. It's original. The verse numbers and the titles are not. They're added later to help us differentiate psalm from psalm and where in the psalm we are. This psalm is a pretty long one. It has 31 verses, so obviously that's a lot of, so the verse numbers, Psalm 22 verse 6, oh, we know right where we are. Psalm 22 verse 30, oh, we know right where we are. Those are later additions in our translations to help us find it, but that superscript is original. It was a notation made from ancient centuries ago about this psalm. And let me just read it to you again. For the director of music, to the tune of the doe of the morning, a psalm of David. So a psalm of David makes sense, but I want to call your attention to the fact that this psalm was set to music, particularly to a well-known, I would suggest, piece of music that all the writer, in this case David, had to say is, I wrote this psalm for the director of music, and I want you to sing it to the tune of the doe of the morning. So that would be something that would be familiar. And so what would happen, since the Psalms are in many ways the worship book of Israel, they would use these in their ongoing worship. This would be likely, much like you go to church today, we sing songs, and some of them very familiar, that we know, memorize, some new songs, some older songs, all that sort of thing. This would be one that they would use. And so I would suggest that Jesus is being very, very intentional in calling attention to this psalm, not just because of the opening, but because of what it would do in the mind of the hearers. When they heard Jesus cry out those words, I imagine they would hear, as Jewish people raised and steeped in the Psalms, this particular song, and it would start playing in their head. That happens to us all the time, doesn't it? You might hear somebody say something and it reminds you of a song, and you start singing the song in your head. That happens to me. It happens to you. Whether it's, I'm not talking listen to the radio and know a song. I mean, you hear something that reminds you of a song and you start singing it in your head. There are many songs that we could use as an example, well-known songs that if I said Sweet Caroline, many of you would probably go dun, 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 because you know that Neil Diamond song, Sweet Caroline. So we and that's our daughter, so that's a big one for us, but nonetheless, that's how music kind of works its way in our mind, and particularly well-known. So I think Jesus is being intentional, not just to express his agony, both physically and spiritually, but to call the people's attention to this particular psalm, this particular part of the Hebrew Bible that is ancient. Because if they started singing the song in their head, or if they started thinking about this psalm that Jesus gives us the first opening words to, they would come across some pretty remarkable things in this psalm. It's not too far later that this psalm, talks about some of the things that sound very much like what is happening to Jesus. It talks about that the people around him mock him and hurl insults at him. When we know that happened, they shake their heads or wag their heads. I think Matthew particularly mentions that in his account, that the people wagged their heads and insulted Jesus. A little bit later it says that they pierced my hands and my feet. Well, isn't that what we think of when we think of crucifixion, that Jesus was nailed to a cross, hands and feet pierced? It may be like Isaiah, he was pierced for our transgressions. And then a little bit later it talks about they divide my clothes, they cast lots for my clothing, and that happens at the cross. One of the punishments of the cross is to debase the person so much that they're stripped, so they take their clothes off, so they're exposed, they're meant to be ashamed and embarrassed as they die, as a symbol of this is what you get if you defy Rome. And so for Jesus they took his clothes and they gambled them off, they cast lots for his clothes. These are all things that happened to Jesus. And so what I think might be happening here, because Jesus is Jesus, he likely did was use this cry from the cross. He cried out in a loud voice just before his death, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And as the Jewish people would hear that and begin to sing the song in their head, they would go, wait a minute. What I'm seeing happen to Jesus is what this psalm talks about. It talks about the things that I'm literally watching happen hundreds of years later, if not 1,000 years later, to Jesus on the cross. That this Hebrew text, this ancient Hebrew worship text, had an object far in the future. And Jesus, I think, is trying to get the people to make that connection. I think it's an important connection, because if you go on, this psalm obviously speaks of anguish, of agony, of difficulty, that your strength is dried up, the tongue sticks to the roof of your mouth, that you're pierced, you need to be rescued, you're in peril. But it ends, the tone toward the end of the psalm, as many psalms that start with a negative or a downcast tone end up becoming great proclamations of faith in God. And this psalm ends just that way. It says in verse 27, all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of nations will bow down before him. For dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. This psalm and the few verses after that end in a song of victory. And isn't that the point of the cross? This psalm starts as lament and ends in victory. The cross looks like defeat, looks like something to be lamented, but it's actually a source of our great victory, because on that cross, where Jesus would cry these words and echo the words of this psalm, he was paying the penalty for sin, and he was making possible for all who would believe in him salvation and victory over sin. He who knew no sin became sin so that we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus bore in his body on the cross, and by all that led up to him, that which I rightfully was due, and he is the perfect spotless Lamb of God wasn't. And so what looks like defeat, what looks like the end by his death on the cross, is actually the beginning of our victory. It's the thing that provides. And one day, as the psalmist says, all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, for dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. That's the end of the story. What Jesus in his death looks like was defeat, God turns into victory by his resurrection. And I don't think it's an accident. I don't think Jesus was just feeling sorry for himself, feeling bad about his situation when he cried out these words. Jesus knew, as I've said all along, he came to die. He came for this purpose, to be that sacrificial lamb, fulfilling all of the Old Testament, all of its sacrificial system, taking on himself the curses of the law, so that we might receive the blessing of life and salvation. Just my favorite thing of the crucifixion story is this verse, are those words Jesus says. And it reminds me of how remarkable he is. Even in a moment of agony, where he's almost wasted away, he speaks these words that sound like defeat, but usher in victory. I hope you've come to know the victory that is available through faith in Jesus Christ. As I say when we talk every week, that's what we get here to talk about. Every time we get together, we want to talk about the victory that is ours, who Jesus is, what he accomplished for us, and how through faith in him, we are a part of his eternal kingdom, where one day everything wrong will be set right, and all of the difficulties of this life, including the worst of sickness and death, will be no more. We'll be with him forever. I hope you know him. If you don't, we encourage you to join us, to learn more about him, to learn what it means to place your faith in him, and to learn what it means to follow him, to be a part of his kingdom, to receive the victory that he offers for us to those who believe in him. Well, I've got a lot to do today. I'm sure you do as well. So I'm going to take this last little bit of coffee, give me that oomph I need, get back at it, and let you get back to your day. That invitation, Sundays at 9 a.m., stands open. Love to see you here. Love to have you worship with us. And so I'll just leave that with you. I hope you have a great week, and we'll talk again soon.